Services Marketing, MKT 625, Lecture number 19.
Assalamu alaikum, Khawateen wa Hazrat. Wasim Hassan welcomes you to lecture number 19 of Services Marketing, MKT 625 at the Virtual University of Pakistan. We are done with different kinds of marketing research studies, and we have seen that we have a dozen of those that we can employ in order to come up with the right facts that we need to make better marketing decisions. And we also have seen that some of those pertain to the qualitative side, while the remaining are related with the quantitative side. So a combination of qualitative marketing research and quantitative marketing research is a bundle of different studies which can form a very effective program. And the essence of that program should be that it has to be a composite one, and it should be carried out from time to time on a continuous basis. It cannot be an isolated kind of an effort, meaning something very episodic in nature. Rather, it has to be something which continues from time to time. Another thing that we concluded from the previous lecture and the ones before that is that the marketing research has got to be very valuable. And the only way that we can make the marketing research valuable is that we make it timely, that we conduct it in a very precise way, and the results that we get out of the research have therefore got to be very credible. So it is that credibility which lets us make better marketing decisions out of the marketing research program. The next point that I made was that once we have the findings from the marketing research, we've got to be able to analyze all those findings so that those could be communicated to the right people. And the right people are the ones who are going to use those results. Until the time those results are used with the purpose of bringing about a change and hence an improvement, the research is not going to be valuable. There are so many different ways whereby we can communicate the marketing research findings to our colleagues within the company. But one of the ways which is very effective and scores the point very efficiently is graphical presentations. We get into making graphical presentations out of the findings that we have generated from the marketing research. Since we have different kinds of studies, what we can do is we really can translate the findings into very effective and convincingly communicable kind of graphics. One of those graphics that really is very popular among marketing managers is that shows us the quality shortfall, meaning the gap between expectations and perceptions of customers. So starting with that, I'll be talking about 3 or 4 different kinds of presentations which should be made use of by marketing managers while they are analyzing results of the marketing research program from study to study. So back to the first one, which is all about performance, meaning company performance and the quality shortfall, or in other words, the quality score could be plotted with the help of the A study, which you are very well familiar with. And I know that your minds are now racing and you know which study I'm going to talk about. Anyway, for the benefit of all of you, let me draw your attention toward the presentation which I'm going to talk about. As you can see from this slide, we have 2 axes. The horizontal axis is about time period, whereas the y-axis signifies expectations and perceptions. What do we mean by time period? Well, we have different time periods starting with 1 to 5, which really means that we have, by the time that we are plotting this study findings, carried out this study 5 times. And the results that we have from 5 different times are depicted on this particular diagram. On the y-axis, we have the score from expectations and perceptions. And like I said, you know very well that we have taken these scores from the ServQual. I would like to recall your attention to the fact that you can have 2 different ratings from ServQual. One about the expectations of customers, and those expectations are not about your company. those expectations relate to one of the excellent companies, meaning one of the major players or competitors in the marketplace, so that you can draw a comparison between those expectations and their perceptions. Their perceptions are their experiences, and that is why we are plotting both expectations and perceptions on the y-axis. As a matter of fact, there is a corresponding relationship between different time periods and their expectations and perceptions. And whatever you see between expectations and perceptions is the quality shortfall. Now, having made this diagram, I think you will agree with me that it becomes very convincing to communicate results to your colleagues, trying to educate them on the shortfall that we have determined with the help of research. We can see that period 1 is a period of shortfall, so is period 2, and right up to period 5, we have not been able to exceed expectations of our customers. This is a pitiful situation which pathetically reflects providers' inability to come up to the expectations of the customer, meaning not during even one period the provider has been able to surpass expectations of the customers. And therefore, there is a tremendous need on part of the provider to stage some recovery strategies which can bring about a change and therefore an improvement. Another thing which you will notice from this presentation is that this talks about just the one dimension of quality, which is reliability. As a matter of fact, this also is a very macro kind of a view, and in order to be very precise, like I said, research has to be very precise and timely. So for the sake of precision, what we should do is, in all preference, we should be taking the one attribute at a time. You will recall the surf call having 21 attributes, but it also offers you the opportunity of making adaptations, and which implies that you can further subdivide those attributes into very specific statements relating to your requirements. For example, if you want to find out to what extent your people have been very prompt and they were on time to deliver the service, you can put that question as part of the reliability dimension. And by the same token, you can plot those attributes of the remaining major dimensions of quality, which are the issues at hand. So in other words, this diagram shows reliability, but what you should do is you should be getting into the very specifics of reliability. And if you think that you should be dividing the dimension of reliability into 5 or 10 different attributes, you can draw as many diagrams relating all those specifics. And that is the beauty of the drawing the diagram, so that you can look into the quality shortfall, if at all there is any. And like I said, you can do that not only with reliability, you can do that with all remaining 4 dimensions. And those dimensions divided into further attributes, and thereby getting not 5 different diagrams, rather you can have 20 different diagrams, or maybe even more. The next diagram, which is very important in order for us to analyze the marketing research results, is the zone of tolerance chart. As you can see from the following diagram, we have 2 axes again. X-axis show the 5 different dimensions of quality, and on the y-axis we have scores, and these scores relate to perceptions. This diagram is going to be developed phase by phase, and I'm going to start with the perception score, which you can see here as red circles. Again, I would draw your attention to the fact that we are dealing here with just one attribute of the major dimension, reliability, which is about providers' ability to be on time. And if we take into consideration responsiveness, we can see that the perception score corresponds with the attribute that says the provider is always willing to help, because he's very responsive, he never looks busy, and he never gives you the impression that he may not be able to respond to your requirements and needs. And therefore, this is a very significant attribute which we think that we should be plotting on this diagram. The third one is about assurance, and the attribute, meaning the division of this particular dimension, is you feel safe what we're saying here is that you feel safe in the hands of this particular provider because he instills confidence and trust into you. And that is why we are dealing with this particular attribute. When it comes to empathy, we are dealing with individual attention, which the provider has the ability and the competence and the willingness to do. Because of the fact that you get individual attention, the provider is very empathetic and listens to you, responds to you, and is willing to fulfill the need that you have. The fifth one is about tangibles, and the score is about the modern equipment that the provider has as a support to all that he is doing. Now, once we have plotted perceptions of customers on this chart, we have to move ahead with the zones of tolerance. The question here is, how do we draw those zones? And I would like to take you back to the serve call, because I know that many of you must be thinking that it again is the serve call which is going to help us draw this diagram. But the answer is not 100% what you may think. We certainly have plotted the perception score from the serve call, and the perception score is the experience of the customers which they got from the service that you sold to them. And now when it comes to plotting the zones, we have to make certain adaptations. Again, what I'm saying is we've got to get into the variations of the serve call. Keep in mind that you already have two ratings, and those two ratings are about competitions standing in the marketplace by way of their expectations from an excellent provider. And the next rating that you generated with the help of serve call was about their perception. And that perception is the one which sits on this chart by way of these red circles. Now, getting back to the actual drawing of the zones, we have to go into a little variation of the serve call and develop the third part of it. And we can do that by help of designing a question which could be very direct, having two different parts, the one about customers' minimum level of expectations and the other about their desirable level of expectations. Meaning, what is it that they are going to take as the minimum possible standard of the service that you may offer, and what should be the desirable level of service. Let me show you that question by way of a slide, because it is extremely important for you to develop the right questionnaire so that you can come up with the right plotting in terms of the graphical presentations. As you can see from this slide, which is about adequate and desired expectations, you are asking your customers the one question about reliability. And do not lose sight of the fact that you are asking this question about their being on time. So in other words, we are again dealing with one very specific attribute. We are not dealing with reliability as a macro dimension of quality evaluation, because that could be misleading. However, if you think that given your circumstances, you can do that, there is nothing stopping you. But what is preferable is to get into the specifics of attributes which really matter in terms of their impact on the customer and therefore on the performance of the company. And that is the point which I'm trying to drive home. Coming back to the question which you should develop as the third part of your serve call, and which will give you kind of a third rating on how customers may think about your product, asking them to compare their minimum level which they expect of your service with what you may think. Now, if you take a look at this scale, this also is from 1 to 7. 4 is the middle of the road kind of evaluation which you think should be the minimum possible. However, you should not be the one as provider who may think that 4 is the right rating or the right score. But this is what you may think is the bare minimum. And the customer, incidentally, also has ticked that particular rating as the minimum level of his expectation, meaning the minimum level which he expects of your service in terms of its quality on the reliability dimension, and the specific attribute is the ability of the provider, meaning your ability of being on time. Now, when you carry out this study from time to time, you can find out what customers really think on a continuous basis about your reliability dimension. The next part of this question is that you request your customers to compare their desired level of service with what you are offering. And the question is, again, a self-complete kind of a statement. And the customer says, compared with my desired level, your service performance is expected to be, in this particular case, he says 7. Now, it is very obvious that when customers are asked in very specific terms as to what should be the desired level of service, I think it obviously goes without saying that the customer would say the highest possible rating, because when you show a scale of 1 to 7, the desired level should be 7. However, there may be customers who might say that they are willing to settle with 6 as the desired level of expectation, and thereby giving you the A zone, which is going to be different from the one that we can come up with the help of this particular question and this particular rating. So as you can see from this question, meaning two parts of the question, the minimum level of for the customer in terms of your attribute of being on time is 4, whereas the desirable level is rated as 7. So the zone of tolerance has been determined as having 4 its lower limit and 7 its higher limit. Now let us go to another slide which is going to show us how to draw these zones. It is the same slide which showed us the perception scores by way of those red circles. And now what we are seeing is right above those circles on all the 5 dimensions, meaning in relation to those specific questions that we are asking them, the zones of tolerance. The minimum level is the bottom of the zone, and the maximum level is the desirable level of expectation in all the 5 cases. The size of the zone varies from dimension to dimension. It just happens to be incidental that the zones of tolerance in terms of reliability and responsiveness happen to be just the same size, but the assurance is a narrow zone. So what does that imply? That implies that you've got to be able to operate within a narrow zone, because even the minimum level or the adequate level of service which the customer expects from your company is pretty high, and it sits higher than the dimension of responsiveness and reliability. And the next one is empathy, which you can see is again carries a different size. The zone is broader in comparison with assurance, because the customers may think to themselves that even if these people are not highly empathetic, they're going to accept that, and that is why the adequate level of service sits a little lower. However, when it comes to tangibles, you can see the interpretation is that the customers do not really seem to be caring too much about the physical evidence, and that's why this zone of tolerance is pretty broad, which means that the adequate level of service is pretty low, and the desired level of service, of course, is the highest possible, which is 7. Now, further interpretation of this the chart could be that this company is not really performing on merit when it comes to the features of the service as well as the delivery of the service. What really is wrong with the features or the delivery mechanism could be found out with an in-depth analysis of ServQual, assisted by other support studies which you can carry out in order to pinpoint the exact problem the company is running into. But what is important from this particular diagram is that on the dimension of reliability, the perception is much lower than the minimum level of service, thereby meaning that not only that the company has not been able to convincingly surpass the adequate level, it is much below the adequate level, meaning a service failure. The case with responsiveness may be a little better, but not very encouraging at all, because the perception score is sitting just on the line of the adequate level of service, thereby again signifying that the company has to do quite a bit in order to come up to the expectations of the customer. again, a service failure. And what the company must be doing should be analyzed with the help of different studies, like I said. Let's talk about the assurance. Again, the company seems to be miserably failing because the adequate level of service in terms of the provider's ability to instill confidence and trust into its customers has not manifested itself convincingly. Actually, it is a failure because, again, the perception score is lower than the adequate level of service. This is, of course, a hypothetical situation, and the point is not to rub in the failure of any particular supplier. The point here is to drive home the importance of service failure and the importance of different kinds of studies of marketing research, so that you can exactly pinpoint the problems in order to stage the recovery strategies. We are going to talk about recovery strategies in detail in a couple of lectures from today. Let's now talk about the next dimension, which is empathy, and you can say that the perception score hardly sits above the adequate level that he expects. Again, and not a very good score, but the better than assurance and reliability, and also responsiveness. Now, this might have occurred because of the fact that some of the frontline contact people were empathetic, and they were quite willing to understand the problem of the customers, and were also willing to offer personalized kind of service. But this also could be incidental, and therefore you need to carry out this study one more time at least, if not more, in order to see that you really are comfortable with the perception score on empathy. The next one is tangibles, because of the fact that this is a very broad zone, and the customers do not seem to be giving too much importance to this particular dimension. However, your score on perception, meaning the perception by customers of the physical evidence that you have, is pretty high, and it is very close to the desired level of expectations. Now, you might feel happy and comfortable with being provider that on this particular dimension, you seem to be passing, and you seem to be surpassing the adequate level of service and sitting very close to the desired service level. But this may not be a source of consolation. You know why? Because this seems to be a case of misguided allocation of resources to physical evidence. The fact is that the company seems to be failing on all four other dimensions, and the service features, the delivery mechanism do not seem to be in place and do not seem to be very much compatible with the expectations of the customers, thereby signifying something fundamentally wrong with the company. And physical evidence being very much in line with, or rather being a little high on their expectations, signifies that you have allocated resources to something customers do not really give too much importance to. And therefore, it is the four other dimensions which you have to look into. Now, this is something which really brings us into the importance of other studies, whereby we should try to find out what is the importance which customers attach to different dimensions of quality, so that we can allocate our resources to those dimensions. And you can easily see how strategic is the whole process, that we have to make sure that the investments which are going into the operation are very well guided investments in the right direction, so that you follow the vision and the mission of the company by not derailing the efforts. However, the case here, by looking at this chart, seems to be different. The company has derailed itself and looks like it is going to get itself into the ground because perception scores are very low. Another important thing which I would like to point out here, just like I pointed out in relation to the previous slide, which I showed you, that you are dealing with very specific attributes of 5 different dimensions of quality. The research has got to be very specific. You should not generalize every single attribute which you think is going to have impact on the decision-making process of the customer, meaning the pre-purchase and anything which is going to impact his decision while he interacts during the encounter. and anything which is going to establish his future behavior, either by his being satisfied or dissatisfied, has to be looked into very specifically so that you can come up with a credible design of research and have results which could be very effectively used in order to bring about a change and improvement. Because research is all about staging a change. It has to be change driven, and it must stage some kind of improvement. Another feature which I would like to point out here is that the scales which you use for rating by customers should be preferably very similar or rather identical. Meaning, if you have a rating of like 1 to 7 on the serve qual, any adaptation of serve qual that you come up with should also contain a rating of like 1 to 7. You might see different kinds of ratings in different textbooks, like from 1 to 9 or 1 to 10, but that might confuse you a little bit, because just suppose if we were to come up with the adaptation of the serve qual by asking the question on the adequate level of expectation and the desired level of expectation on a scale of 1 to 9, the average score would have been 5, which according to the question we are asking is 4. What if the customer told you that he was expecting 5 as the minimum level? The perception score which you are going to have on this particular diagram is going to be misrepresented, and the perception score is going to be closer to the adequate level of the zone of tolerance, thereby giving you a distorted picture. So I would recommend that you work with scales which are very identical. Meaning, if you have a scale of 1 to 7 on the original serve qual, you should have a scale of 1 to 7 as well on any other adaptation or variation of that tool, because that is one of the more important tools of marketing research, and also plotting the findings of research in order to communicate these findings very effectively to your colleagues. You will agree with me that when you have this kind of a diagram to present to your colleagues and explaining things the way I am explaining to you, it is going to make your case much more convincing than if you were to just talk about numbers and the narrative side of those numbers. It is much better to come up with a presentation like this and then talk with your colleagues who are going to be the frontline contact people by explaining the interpretations of the graphical presentation. Let us now get on to the next one, which again is going to be a very important tool at the disposal of the marketing managers. This particular presentation is a representation of the importance which customers attach to different attributes of your service, and then you can relate that importance as ranked by your customers with your performance. Now, again, you will need maybe 2 different studies in order to come up with this kind of a presentation. And that really signifies the importance of carrying out different kinds of studies so that you have results from so many different angles and dimensions and come up with something which is very comprehensive in terms of interpretation for better decision making. Just take a look at this slide. As you can see, it also has 2 axes, the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. Now, this is kind of a diagram which also could have been made in the traditional way by showing just one side of the y-axis and one side of the x-axis which sits at the bottom. But just to make it more pictorial and more graphically meaningful, I have given you a cross-section of the 2 axes. The x-axis is all about perceptions, meaning the perception score of customers relating their experiences. And again, you can refer to the marketing research tool which I've been talking about so much, and that is the serve qual. Perceptions are going to be translated on this particular axis by way of your performance, meaning if somebody has rated you in terms of his perception as 7, your performance has been high. So we can say that the left side of the perceptions is the low side, whereas the right side of the axis is the high side, meaning you have performed pretty well on this particular side. take a look at the y-axis, meaning the vertical axis. These are all about importance which customers attach to the attributes of your service. Now, here we have a tricky situation. What are the attributes that we should be talking about? Or what are the attributes that we should be plotting? And how should we be plotting those attributes on this diagram so that we can draw a relationship between those attributes, meaning the importance customers attach to those attributes, with your performance score? That is where the trick lies. First of all, we've got to be clear about the kind of research which we have to carry out in order to attach customers' importance to our attributes. And therefore, even before that, we have to kind of specify the attributes that we are talking about. Now, let me tell you that in this particular context, I'm talking about the word attributes, which is interchangeable with features at so many places of the marketing. But here in this particular context, I'm talking about attributes which in technicality means that these are the ingredients of the overall features. For example, if you have one feature, it can be divided into so many different attributes. And I'm going to talk about that in just about a moment from now. The important thing is that these coordinates give you 4 different quadrants, quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and 4. And you can take a look at these quadrants if you move counterclockwise. The left lower one is Q1, and on the right you have Q2. If you go upwards, you have Q3, and then leftwards, you have Q4 right on top. Why is it that Q3 and Q4 are shaded? That is something that I'm going to talk about. That is going to be the explanation of the whole concept of plotting these findings by way of this diagram. Let us take a look at the attributes which I was talking about, and you will know what is it that we should be plotting. And even before that, what is it that we should be researching about? Let us take 2 different examples, the one pertaining to hospital and the other pertaining to a fast food setup. Talking about the hospital, we can have so many different attributes like quality of equipment, availability of services, diagnostics and tests, meaning the facility of different kinds of diagnostics and tests. And we can talk about quality of emergency room. We can talk about friendliness of personnel, competence of personnel, and appearance of personnel. And we also can talk about atmosphere and decor and cleanliness. If you talk about the attributes of a fast food restaurant, they're not going to be very much different from those of a hospital. They're going to be quite close to what I've just talked about, meaning quality of food, variety of food, meaning the company's ability to offer diversification of menu, meaning menu diversity. Now, when we talk about menu diversity, we are basically talking about the competence level of the company in terms of its operational ability. We also can talk about another feature of the fast food by way of service delivery, as to what extent the restaurant is good at delivering the service. We can also talk about promptness of the personnel and quality of equipment, because when we talk about the menu diversification, we cannot really talk about that until we really have diversity of equipment. So therefore, there's got to be a relationship between different features and attributes, so to say. If I'm using the 2 terms interchangeably, inadvertently, please ignore that, because what I'm trying to arrive at is the distinction in this very contextual sense between features and attributes. Back to features, we can also talk about the atmosphere and decor in relation to restaurant, just like we talk about the hospital. We can also talk about the quickness of home delivery. Now, just look at this particular feature, which is very different from the overall service delivery. The overall service delivery may pertain to the in-house delivery. When you walk into the restaurant, sit there, and you evaluate the restaurant on that particular dimension. But when you order food for your home or office, it becomes a different story altogether. It is a different perspective altogether. And the variables of the 2 situations are so very different that they really take us into the area of our competence and ability of managing our operations. We shall be talking about these factors from time to time, and you can build up your knowledge with the base relating different dimensions of the subject as a whole. The next one that we can talk about is the drive-through facility. How quick they are, because the drive-through facility is all about quickness, and if the company takes quite a bit of time there and you have to wait, you are not going to rate the company very well on this particular dimension. And of course, in this particular context, we are talking about these features in terms of the importance which customers relate to these features. Now, having talked about these features, which I think interchangeably use the terminology attributes, could be in actuality divided into so many attributes. Let's go back to the hospital and talk about the quality of equipment. Now, what does it mean? It could be an overall macro feature, but when you talk about attributes, you have to talk about different kinds of equipment. You can talk about the equipment which is part of the room, for example, the equipment for checking blood pressure and equipment for checking other things, which you may look into, even not understanding what it is all about, but certainly getting an impression that these are the equipments which can be used in any given situation of emergency. This is the one example of the division of one particular feature into different attributes. If you take a look at diagnostics and tests, you will realize that a hospital cannot be evaluated on quality dimension in positive terms by customers if they tell you to go somewhere else to have certain diagnostics and tests administered on the patient and then come back to the hospital for further treatment. Now, this is something which you should keep in mind while devising your questionnaire. What is it that the customers may like to have by your offering the kinds of the facilities and services at your disposal. The other feature which we can talk about is the emergency room. We say quality of emergency room. Now, the quality of emergency room is a very macro kind of a statement, although it's not meaningless. It is a very meaningful statement. But then you've got to look into the number of doctors that are attending to the patients there, and the competence of the nursing staff, and the overall services that are offered as a composite thing as part of the emergency room. If you take a look at the friendliness of personnel and competence of personnel and appearance of personnel, this takes us into another important area which I must talk about here while giving you examples of how to divide features into attributes. We are talking about essentially the importance which customers attach with different attributes. And in that regard, I have made an attempt to tell you how you can differentiate between attributes and features. One of the things that we must remember here is that when we carry out this research of importance, we must take into account different quality dimensions that we are dealing with. You know why? Because when we talk about three different statements of features, friendliness of personnel, competence of personnel, and appearance of personnel, looks like we are very much focused on the personnel. Now, that is not something which is the essence of this particular study. The essence here is that we are dealing with different dimensions. When we talk about friendliness of personnel, that touches the dimensions of responsiveness and empathy. And when we talk about competence of personnel, we are touching, reliability and also responsiveness. Reliability in particular. And when we talk about appearance of personnel, we are talking basically about the characteristics of physical evidence. So just look at the differences which these three statements present to you. And the reason that I'm talking about these features is just to rub the point in that while you design this kind of research, whereby you try to ascertain the importance they attach to different attributes, you have to take into account attributes from a cross-section of the quality dimensions. And you are not to take the different attributes from a cross-section just for the fun of it actually you take those attributes which you think that by your experience and by the findings that you've been having in the past that really have the ability to impact your decision making and customers' decision making. So all those attributes which can be impactful are to be taken into consideration in this kind of research. Now, after having explained to you the features and features subdivided into attributes, we can easily go back to the slide which I showed you a few moments ago, and let us take a look at the 4 quadrants in order to see how we are going to plot performance scores and the attributes in terms of their importance. One thing goes without saying, that the importance research already has been carried out, and you know the importance they attach. Now it's a question of only plotting that on this particular field, and you can go back to ServQual in order to have the scores or the ratings on perceptions and start with 1 and go up to right 7 on the horizontal x-axis. And once you have done that, start looking into the ratings which customers could have given you in relation to different attributes. If there is a corresponding relationship between 1 and one of the attributes, okay, you draw a circle there and see where it sits on one of the 4 quadrants. I mean, it just cannot go outside of these 4 quadrants. It has to be on one of these 4. If the score is too good for a certain attribute or a certain attributes, you have to look into that and draw a corresponding circle. By doing that, while you go through all the ratings from 1 to 7, you are going to be done with all the attributes as illustrated by way of research to you by the customers. And these corresponding relationships are depicted by way of these blue circles. Now, once we have plotted all these ratings and scores on this diagram, we are to interpret this because we really want to communicate the findings to our colleagues in order to make them graphically interesting and in marketing terms very meaningful. You will see that the 2 quadrants Q3 and Q4 are shaded. They are shaded because they have emerged as the 2 most important quadrants. I mean, 50% of the quadrants are the ones which you really pay a lot of attention to. If you take a look at Q3, you are very high on performance because your customers have rated you on the high side. And you have, with that performance, corresponding relationship with the attributes which you can see on the vertical axis. Now, this really means that these 2 attributes are the ones customers pay highest attention to or importance to because they are very high on the vertical axis. At the same time, your performance on the x-axis or the horizontal axis also has been very high. So it is a combination of high, and therefore this is something that has got to be maintained. You have been performing so well, and the attributes also have been declared by the customers as very important in their eyes, and therefore the strategic direction that you are following in order to deliver your service is just about the right direction, and you've got to maintain that. Do not deviate, and anything that you do, you have to do that from the standpoint of bringing about an improvement. Now, let's go to quadrant 4, which is on the left-hand side of the green quadrant, and we'll see that we have 3 different attributes sitting there. Now, on this quadrant, we can see that the performance scores have not been very high because it is to the left of the horizontal axis, thereby signifying a low score. However, the importance customers attach to these attributes is as high as you saw in Q3. The meaning, in the eyes of the customers, these attributes are extremely important, but your performance has been low, and therefore you need to give a lot of attention to this quadrant, meaning these attributes. You must stage some recovery strategies. So what I'm saying is that the strategic direction here is going to be altogether different. And the allocation of resources toward these attributes is going to be altogether different. And this can be related with what you saw in the previous model of graphical presentation, which was about the zones of tolerance, where I explained that the customers did not seem to be giving too much importance to the physical evidence properties of the quality dimensions, because they were more concerned about the other ones. Now, here I think is a case where this company might have given more importance to that kind of a dimension and not looking into the attributes which have been rated as very high in terms of their importance. So the point that I'm trying to express here is that you need to have very accurate results so that you can devise the strategic direction that you need to devise to hit the destination. And destination planning is dependent upon accurate results of the marketing research program, which can be depicted on this particular chart. Let's talk about Q1 and Q2. Q1 is a quadrant where the score has been low, as well as the importance given by customers to these attributes, which are just about 2, is not very high. Now, this is not to say that we just forget these attributes and we do not perform well on these, but these are the ones which do not carry as much importance as is the case with Q3 and Q4. So I leave that to your imagination and your interpretation if you were to be a service provider. Let's now move on to Q2, which is high on performance, but not very high on importance as envisioned by your customers. So these are the attributes which are not really very important in the eyes of the customers. And the fact of the matter is that the example which I gave you in relation to the physical evidence on the previous graphical model in relation to Q4 is more appropriately related here, because this is a case where the company seems to be allocating resources in the wrong direction. Their performance is very high, and the customers say, well, you have done very well, but we do not really think that these attributes are too much important to us. And therefore, in future, you may not allocate the kind of resources which you have employed here. These are the resources which should be transferred to quadrant 4. And that is the beauty of plotting these findings so that you can make corrections to your strategies and the whole strategic framework. With the explanation of this graphical presentation, we now move on to another element of communication, which along with marketing research really helps the top management of companies to stay in close contact with customers and thereby knowing what really is going on during encounters and what's really happening when interactions take place. The reason marketing experts talk about this kind of communication is because there are certain things which can be generated in an informal way as against a very well-structured program of marketing research. So what I'm saying is that we are now totally done with the fundamental understanding of marketing research in relation to services marketing and the kinds of studies that we really can kick off to get the right the kind of findings and then being able to plot those in order to communicate the same to our colleagues who are going to use those results in order to bring about a change and improvement in the service level. So back to this the informal kind of communication, this is the one which is known as communication for the top management, or research for upward communication. That is the other terminology used by marketing experts. This also is kind of research, although it takes place, like I said, in an informal manner. And the reason there is a need for this kind of research to be conducted because there are many companies that are large enough not to be able to maintain a close and a direct contact with their customers. If you happen to be a small provider, you really can be in contact with your customers who are just a handful and thereby know what really is happening during encounters. May those be the face-to-face encounters or remote encounters by way of their dealing with your websites, or those may be telephone encounters. With this objective, good companies institute practices that can bring management closer to customers. And the reason they like to stay close to customers is because they've got to be very accurate in terms of assessing their requirements. So it is not just the frontline contact people who should be well aware of the requirements and needs of customers. It also has to be the top management, more so than the contact persons, because top management's job it is to come up with the strategic directions. It is their responsibility to develop different service products, and again, it is their responsibility to see to it that those service products are being delivered to the customers the way they want, and there is just no gap. And do not forget that we are talking from the typical standpoint of trying to plug the gap number one, and that is why the top management has to stay very close to customers. For the shortage of time, I am not in a position to talk about different techniques which managements employ in order to stay close to the customer, and I would like to summarize what I've talked during today's lecture by way of telling you that there is a tremendous need on part of the top management to be very close to the customers. And in order to achieve that objective, the service organizations they generally do not have too many layers of the management, so that they really can cut across unnecessary layers and stay close to the customers and have the right flow of the right information which they need. So the summary of today's lecture is that the findings that we need to have by the way of marketing research program have got to be very accurate, precise, and very timely, and we've got to be in a position to convey those to the people who really matter in terms of implementing those. And one of the ways is that we convey those by way of making graphical presentations, and to support all those programs that I've been talking so far, we also need to have research for upward communication, which is meant for top management in order to stay close to the customer. And that is the topic with which I'll be starting my next lecture, along with relationship marketing, which is going to be discussed in detail. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to talking with you. Allah Hafiz until then.